Listen to the music. Peter, Paul, and Mary. Be back in a minute. I'm going to read a Marcy story.
Kim. Conversations with your children, how to set healthy boundaries, address behavior issues, and how to create a safe space in your home. Hi, I'm your host, Dr. Nancy Iankowitz. Marcy's World airs between 9 and 10 a.m. Saturday mornings exclusively on WPWL 103.7 FM, Polling Public Radio. We're streaming live right now over Marcy's World Facebook page. And now I invite you to all join me in Marcy's World. We're going to get there using our imagination.
Today's story is Picking the Right Behavior. It felt great to get outside for recess. The sun was bright, and the crisp December air blew through the bare limbs of tall maple and oak trees. Marcy loved to eat lunch outside at the picnic table. She finally had chunky peanut butter instead of creamy. She loved to hear crunch when she chewed. The baby carrots didn't disappoint her either, because they were her favorite. "Marcy, are you going to join up?" asked Niki, her very best friend in the entire world. "I'm not sure. What are you going to do?" "Well," Niki answered, "I like soccer, but my dad is coach of the co-ed baseball team." Marcy wondered, can we join both? Niki thought about that. "I don't know. Let's ask Mrs. C." So both girls walked over to the teacher and asked their question. You know, it's very important to be able to go over to a teacher or an adult to straighten stuff out if you're not quite sure about scheduling or really anything. If you feel safe with an adult, you're very lucky, and that's the adult you should tap into as a resource. "Excuse me, Mrs. C," asked Marcy. "Is it possible to join both soccer and baseball at the same time?" Oh, Mrs. C thought about that. Not too many people asked that question, and it was a good one. "I think so, Marcy, but you need to check with the coaches because the practice schedules have to be taken into consideration." You know, adults have a way of giving us more to think about than we really thought about before, which is why it's so important to be able to ask questions, even if you think the answers are going to be very simple. And sometimes, even if you think you know the answer, it's good to double check. And a lot of times it takes courage to ask questions. Because sometimes, did it ever happen to you that when you were thinking of asking a question because you were confused about something, you might have been a little bit afraid you would sound silly to somebody? Well, that happens a lot. But it does take courage, and it's very important to be able to ask the right people the right questions. So Marcy asked Mrs. C, and Mrs. C told her she needed to check with the coaches, and the practice schedules had to be taken into consideration. "Thanks, Mrs. C," said Marcy and Niki as they walked off to weigh their options, so she gave them something to think about. Marcy and Niki had a lot to consider. Not only did they have to be sure the practice schedules would work out okay, but they needed to be sure they would have enough time to do homework and studying. Now, right now, if you're listening to this story, it's being read in July, which is the summertime. And you don't have to be so concerned about school and scheduling for school. But when school starts up again, you might want to keep in mind all types of schedules. Sometimes we overschedule ourselves and we don't leave enough time for thinking and private time. And time is a very, very important gift we can give to ourselves. It helps us to keep perspective when we use it wisely. So think about that. So both girls decided to think about the time they would need to do their homework and studying, and they then agreed to talk again tomorrow after asking their parents for advice. How smart. They realized they should tap into additional adults as resources. They were being like scientists. They were on an investigative journey trying to figure out if they can fit something into their schedule. That made them scientists. Just then the bell rang. Recess was over, and it was time to go back to class. Marcy and Niki did almost everything together. They sat together, they walked together, they ate lunch together, and they played together. They even knew each other's telephone numbers by heart. Yep, Marcy and Niki were pretty good friends. They walked into class side by side and noticed most of the students were seated already. Marcy looked at the clock and wondered if she and Niki were late. That's sort of like a scientific experiment. She made an observation. She had a question. She looked for the evidence, the clock, and she checked out to see if her question was answered one way or another way. And that's following the scientific method. Once you get into 7th grade, this will all make sense. But Marcy looked at the clock and wondered if they were late. The bell didn't ring yet. The minute hand was only on the 11, and they knew class didn't begin again until it hit the 12. So both girls took their seats and felt pretty good that they weren't late. Suddenly, a huge noise came through the door. It was Brian. He marched to his seat like a soldier and plopped down very loudly. Brian was usually very noisy, especially when he was supposed to be quiet. It was the most unusual thing Marcy and Niki ever saw. Brian knew how to be quiet. He just never seemed to know when to do it. Like when the gym teacher told everyone to jump up and down, Brian stood quietly. When the music teacher told everyone to sing, Brian was again very quiet. When the librarian asked everyone to read silently, Brian would sing a tune from a movie or commercial. Or he would dance or wiggle in his chair and make strange sounds. So when Brian came through the door, nobody was really surprised that he was noisy, because since everyone else was quiet, it just made sense that Brian would probably choose the opposite behavior. And in that, he was becoming very predictable. What began to happen, once everyone got used to Brian picking opposite behaviors, they began to ignore him. Nobody seemed to pay attention anymore. And Marcy wondered if this made Brian happy or sad. What do you think? Did Brian want attention, or did he just not know how to figure out what to do when? Marcy, whispered Niki, let's go ask Brian why he does what he does. So there go the girls again with their scientific method. They have a question, and now they're going to do the research. Okay, Marcy agreed, but let's be nice about it. I don't want him to think we're being mean or picking on him. I'm just really curious, just as you are. Both girls walked over to Brian, and Niki asked the question. Brian, how come you do goofy stuff in class? Well, said Brian, I think it's cool. I don't like to be typical. I like to shake things up. Whoa. But Brian, you can get into trouble because we're supposed to be learning how to pick the right behaviors. We need to pick the right behavior for the right situation. We have to prove to our teachers that we know what to do and when to do it. Didn't you know that? Marcy was sincerely curious. Brian looked surprised. Nope, I really didn't. I just thought I was being funny and cool. I didn't realize part of school is to teach us how to pick the right behavior. Are you sure? Both girls looked like they were a little bit in shock. Just step out of the story for a second. We pick behavior based on what we think is the right thing to do. Sometimes we can pick behavior because we know it's the wrong thing to do, but that's really taking a chance. So we pick behavior based on the right thing to do, and we try to learn the right things to do at the right time. And what makes something right? What makes something right is if it helps spread good feelings, or if it helps somebody else to build something or accomplish something that they want to accomplish, or if it helps us to be the best we can be. And that's what helps us to decide what's right and what's wrong in terms of a behavior. Thank you. So Brian said, nope, I really didn't. I just thought I was being funny. Are you sure? And the girls said, yes, very sure. Let's ask Mrs. C. There they go again, being scientists, checking out their hypothesis. They had a question, and they're going to investigate for the answer. So all three friends, Niki, Marcy, and Brian, very good, you're listening carefully. All three friends went over to Mrs. C, who was very happy to explain that part of second grade is learning how to match up the right behavior with the right situation. Brian looked at Niki and Marcy and gave a very friendly smile and said, thanks a lot. You really taught me something. And that's sort of how we get confirmation that what we did was the right thing to do, or what we said was the right thing to say. Because if it's honest and true to our spirit and helps somebody feel good, not if we make something up and pretend just to make somebody feel good, then do something wrong behind their back. That's not the right thing to do. But if you're doing the right thing and somebody said, wow, that was helpful, then you know right away, yeah, you got confirmation that that was the right choice. You're welcome, both girls said at the same time, and then they giggled and felt very good about themselves and each other, because it feels good when we make proper choices that are true to our spirit and that help somebody else and help ourselves too. Hey, listen, said Brian, do you want to go join the co-ed soccer team? My mom is the coach and we need a few more players. Marcy and Niki looked at each other, because, just step out of the story for a second, that all these schedules were on their mind all day. Just so interesting that Brian happened to be on the same page with them about that. So Marcy and Niki looked at each other. Sounds great, but we agreed to talk it over with our parents before signing up for anything else. No problem, Brian said. Just tell your parents to come to the meeting tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. It's in the multipurpose room, and that's where you can sign up. That was very impressive. That was a lot of information that Brian just gave the girls. And also, just another point to make about this, Marcy and Niki made an agreement to talk to their parents before making commitments to any additional teams, or to even decide which teams to join, how many to join, and how many to add on to their schedule. It was very, very impressive that when Brian came along with an additional suggestion, question, or recommendation, they stuck with their agreement, and neither one said, oh, sure, outside of their agreement. They stuck with their agreement to check it over with their parents and get back to Brian. And that's teamwork. That's working with somebody else, sticking with your agreements, and not changing without discussing with them or following the initial agreement. So Brian said that's where they sign you up. Thanks a lot, Brian. Gosh, you know a lot of stuff. When you get all goofy, and pick behaviors that don't fit the situation, it isn't so easy to see how smart you are. Brian realized and thought about it and said, yeah, I know. Well, I hope you folks sign you up. I love soccer. And just as Brian shouted the last part of that sentence, he threw his hands up in the air, tossed his head back, dropped his books, his binder popped open, his papers went flying, and he knocked a big box of crayons right off his desk. Niki and Marcy looked like they were in shock. Their eyes bugged out, and their mouths dropped wide open. And Brian said slowly and quietly, that was not exactly the perfectly proper behavior choice for this particular moment in time, was it? They all agreed. Marcy and Niki recovered. They all laughed and worked together to pick up Brian's papers and crayons. However, said Mrs. C., who was standing right over the three giggling children, helping friends is always the proper behavior choice, no matter where you are. Thank you for listening to that story, Picking the Right Behavior of Marcy and her friends. Our guest is on the line. I heard her call in. That was our guest. Yes. And we're going to take a station break. And if you would like to meet Sharon Martin, go to Holistic and Integrative Healing, LLC, and you will hear our interview. We're going to take a station break. You've been listening to WPWL 103.7, Pauling Public Radio. I was just speaking to the Facebook people,